Somaliland declared independence from Somalia in 1991 and has since functioned like a separate country. Recently, U.S. interest in the region has grown due to Somaliland's strategic location near vital shipping lanes and its democratic stability, which contrasts, with the surrounding region. So if stability, democracy, and strategic value aren't enough to earn recognition, what then is? Now, joining us on the conversation to speak or unpack this, we have Professor Aleksi Ylönen, the Horn of Africa Specialist, University of Botswana, and Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies Fellow. He's reaching us from Gaborone in Botswana. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you very much, and happy to be with you.
It's a pleasure. Now, Somaliland has operated with de facto independence since 1991, maintaining its own government, military, and also conducting democratic elections. Yet, it lacks international recognition. Why exactly has the global community hesitated to acknowledge its sovereignty?
Well, it has to do with the circumstances that have been taking place in the Horn of Africa and in the wider region for a long time. Particularly, the great powers tend to look into their interests when they are dealing with smaller countries in the region. It hasn't simply been in the interest of major powers to actually recognize Somaliland. It is sort of a paradox, to be honest, because if we look at the relatively recent past in the Horn of Africa, we have seen the birth of Eritrea and South Sudan, but Somaliland continues not being recognized. But yeah, it has a lot to do with the interests of foreign powers.
All right. Now, from what we know, on January 15, 2025, House China Subcommittee Chair, John Mulliner, wrote that an office in Hargeisa is essential for advancing U.S. interests in the Horn of Africa. Now, do you think that diplomatic outreach alone can outweigh the risk of alienating Mogadishu?
This is a very good question, and I would say there would have to be a sort of a realignment again of external interests to sort of see Somaliland as a more important strategic player in the region, or a strategic partner in the region than Somalia proper would be, and Mogadishu would be. This has so far not materialized, despite the long efforts of the various Somaliland governments to try to get international recognition. It is interesting that in the Horn of Africa, which is a very dynamic region, geopolitically and politically in general, it has been quite a long time since the Cold War that the great powers have not really had an incentive to back Hargeisa more than Mogadishu. And again, it's relatively paradoxical because, as we know, Somaliland itself is a relatively secure region or country, which has government in place for a long time. Democratic elections, for several democratic elections, which Mogadishu has not been able to actually go through. There is a lot that speaks for Somaliland. Also, its strategic location right at the mouth of the Red Sea is one such thing. But the commitment of the great powers has been with Mogadishu. The idea behind it has been that there would eventually be a fully functioning state in Somalia that could then also cater for Somaliland and its interests.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this is not what we have been seeing since the 90s, and even today, the situation, particularly with the extremist Islamist group Al-Shabaab, continues being destabilizing, highly destabilizing in Somalia, and Somalilanders, after all this time, see themselves as different. We are several decades into the declaration of independence of Somaliland. It has built its own state, own institutions. The youth, for example, sees itself different from its counterparts in Mogadishu.
Somalia, yeah.
And I think that there's this identity issue as well in that sense.
All right. Now, you talked about strategic location. What about the MOU that was signed with Ethiopia, granting Addis Ababa a 20-kilometer stretch of coast in return for recognition? Even though Somalia has vehemently opposed to this particular agreement, how sustainable is battering sovereignty for sea access?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting development from last year, January 1st. Yeah. The outgoing president of Somaliland actually had a day prior negotiated with the Somali president in Djibouti. And there had been an agreement that the two would actually reinitiate negotiations between Somalia and Somaliland. President Musa Bihi actually then flew immediately after to Addis Ababa, where he signed the memorandum of understanding with his Ethiopian counterpart, Abiy Ahmed Ali. And this was very interesting because the MOU in itself has not been made public, but it was Musa Bihi himself who immediately after signing actually declared that that was the deal, that in return for sea access and in return for a base, a military or a naval base near Berbera port, would Ethiopia would grant independence and recognize Somaliland. However, Ethiopians never declared that that was fully the deal. They went ahead and explained that this was a cooperation agreement in which there would be all kinds of cooperation that would be sort of revamped with Somaliland, but that they would not really make any declaration on the issue of the recognition itself. Anyway, this was enough to trigger a reaction, of course, in Mogadishu, and also a wider regional confrontation, in which Egypt, in particular, came sort of onto Mogadishu's side and signed a defense treaty with Mogadishu. So there was a sort of a confrontation between Ethiopia and the Mogadishu government for a good part of the year last year, until towards the end of the year, it was Turkey,
Yeah.
which actually served as the mediator between the two countries, and this sort of lessened the tensions between the two. Ethiopia has oftentimes said that it doesn't want to be the first country to actually recognize Somaliland.
Okay.
So there'd be another state that would do that before it would follow.
All right. Just in connection to what you have just said about Ethiopia not wanting to be the only country, according to reports, China's base in Djibouti has actually spurred, U.S. interests, with the U.S. House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, having urged the State Department to establish a representative office in Somaliland in order to counter China's influence. Now, how real is the threat of Beijing establishing a foothold in Somaliland if Washington stands by?
Well, we would have to go back to Somaliland itself and its own agency here. The Somaliland government actually has been staunchly looking for alignment and recognition from the West, particularly from its former colonial master country, which is the UK, United Kingdom, and the US, which is of course seen as the global, the dominant state globally in the past few decades, less so today, obviously. But Somaliland has been staunchly aligning itself in the West, and one of the manifestations of this has been its relations with Taiwan, which were established in 2020. Obviously, this has been a red flag, so to speak, to Beijing. This close cooperation between two states, one partially recognized and another one that has not been recognized officially by any UN member state, but enough to trigger a reaction in Beijing in which China wanted to actually expel Taiwan from Somaliland by establishing ties with promises of development funding and other financial and investment promises. The previous government, the previous president of Somaliland, Musa Bihi, actually had none of it and did not want to engage with Beijing. And has continued, Somaliland has continued on the path of looking towards the West. It has close relationship with Taiwan these days, and of course Taiwan, Somaliland bilateral ties have become important. The possibility of China moving forward is of course largely in the hands of the government in Hargeisa, the Somaliland government. The current president, Abdirahman Irro, who just came to power recently in another democratic election, made commentary earlier on, some years ago. He has expressed some interests with establishing ties with China, with Beijing. In case Somaliland recognition and its other interests will not be actually, or won't be realized and won't be catered for by its Western partners. But there hasn't been any signs of this, and we should say that the Somaliland government has been very actively, even the new government has been very actively looking for establishing even stronger ties with the US, and particularly with the arrival of Donald Trump 2.0 to power.
All right. Now, just briefly before we wrap up this show, we know that Somalia had actually offered the U.S. exclusive control over strategic air bases and ports, including those in Berbera, which is situated in Somaliland. And this actually kind of complicates the whole geopolitical landscape. But then we've heard the African Union and the Arab League have remained silent on Somaliland for so long. What guarantees will persuade them to shift from non-recognition to engagement?
Yeah, of course, that there is this game that both Somaliland and the Mogadishu government are playing, political game, right? It is an utterly difficult situation in many ways, because Mogadishu government granting bases or any kind of installments in the territory of Somaliland is obviously not based on anything that we see on the ground. Obviously, Somaliland is a de facto state that controls its territory. There is no Mogadishu government control of Somaliland's territory. It cannot de facto actually grant any such things. Okay. The US administration knows that, great powers overall know that. Although there is the, so to speak, disputed legal right to do so. I'm saying disputed because Somalilanders and the Somaliland government is disputing that, because they have obviously declared independence and are in control of their territory. It cannot really materialize otherwise, because this is the stalemate situation that we've had for so long. The historical and legal claims for recognition of Somaliland are actually relatively strong. Looking at the historical record and the legal record, and particularly in the Horn of Africa, where I said before, we've had Eritrea and the South Sudanese case. So this is something that causes utter jitters in Mogadishu, and whenever Somaliland is or seems to have increased the prospects of gaining recognition, Mogadishu tries to counter in some ways. Okay. And that's what we've seen now.
All right. Well, sadly, we have to wrap up this conversation here. I wish we had more time. Professor Aleksi Ylönen, the Horn of Africa Specialist, the University of Botswana, and Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies Fellow. Thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us on this topic.